Hey everyone, did you know that over 90% of you watching right now haven't hit that subscribe button yet? If you're enjoying our stories about real-life gangsters, take just a second to subscribe. It's free, and it really helps us keep bringing you more true gangster tales every day. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into another story from the world of the mob. They called him Matty the Horse, not because he was fast, but because he was strong, steady, and unshakable. In a world built on fear and betrayal, Ianniello had something most men didn't: control. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to threaten. One look from him was enough. Behind that quiet stare was a man who'd learned that real power wasn't about who could shout the loudest. It was about who could stay calm when everyone else lost their nerve. Brooklyn, 1930s. The city pulsed with restless energy, streetlights flickering over cobblestone roads, kids playing stickball while men in long coats whispered in doorways. It was a time when a smart boy could rise fast, if he knew when to keep his mouth shut. And young Matty always knew when to stay silent. He grew up in Little Italy, surrounded by the rhythm of the neighborhood, bakery smoke in the air, church bells on Sundays, and the quiet conversations that stopped when a stranger walked by. His father was a hard-working immigrant who believed in honest labor. But in the post-Depression streets of New York, honest didn't always feed a family. Matty saw men with slick suits and full wallets stepping out of shiny cars while honest men like his father came home tired and broke. That contrast lit something inside him, a quiet fire. He started small, running errands for the local guys, carrying envelopes, sweeping the floors at the social club. He was quick to learn and even quicker to earn trust. He never asked questions, never complained, never forgot a face. Soon, people started calling him the kid with the calm eyes. By the time he was 20, Matty had joined the military, serving in World War II. He was disciplined, reliable, and earned the nickname Horse from his fellow soldiers because of his endurance. While other men complained or panicked, Matty just kept moving forward, steady and unstoppable. The army gave him structure, and for a time, he thought it might give him direction too. But when he came back to New York, the city was different. The war was over, but another kind of battlefield awaited him. The streets had changed hands, and the men running them had grown richer and more ruthless. That's when Matty crossed paths with Vincent, the Chin Gigante, and the quiet giants of the Genovese family. The world of organized crime wasn't what Hollywood made it out to be. There were no loud boasts or endless gunfire. It was business. Real business. Restaurants, bars, vending machines, construction contracts, unions. Behind every smile was strategy, and Matty fit right in. He started managing bars in Manhattan, but these weren't ordinary bars. They were the kind of places that never made the papers, yet everyone knew who owned them. They were the heartbeat of the city's nightlife, filled with laughter, cash, and connections. Matty became the invisible hand behind it all. What set him apart was his balance. He didn't act out of ego. While other guys built reputations on fear, Matty built his on consistency. When problems came, and they always did, he handled them quietly, efficiently. He didn't enjoy confrontation, but he never backed away from it either. The street learned quickly. If Matty showed up, the issue was already over. By the late 1950s, he was a name everyone in Manhattan knew, even if they pretended they didn't. He controlled the bar scene, the unions, and the flow of money that ran through both. He had influence in places most men could only dream of, inside the Teamsters, in construction, even in city licensing offices. But despite all that power, Matty was never loud about it. He didn't live like a movie mobster. No flashy cars, no wild arrogance. His strength was subtle, like the tide, slow, steady, and inevitable. He preferred a quiet dinner in a back room over champagne in a nightclub. People often underestimated him, mistaking calm for weakness. That was their first mistake. It was around this time that he met a young kid named Tony, a bartender working at one of Matty's spots in Midtown. Tony was ambitious, a bit reckless, and always running his mouth. But Matty saw something in him, something he once had himself. He took Tony under his wing, teaching him how to read people, how to listen more than he spoke. "You don't win fights by shouting," Matty told him once. "You win them by letting the other guy talk himself into a corner." Tony would later say that working for Matty was like going to college for street smarts. "He never yelled, never cursed, but somehow you knew exactly what he wanted," he'd recall years later. "And God help you if you didn't deliver." The 1960s brought a wave of change to New York. The city's nightlife exploded, music, dancing, color, and behind much of it was Matty Ianniello. He had interests in bars across Manhattan, especially those that catered to new crowds, artists, businessmen, even underground clubs that pushed boundaries. To the public, he was just a successful businessman, but behind the scenes, his name was whispered in every back room where deals were made. The FBI started taking notice, of course. They always did. But Matty was careful. He didn't make mistakes. When others got caught flaunting their wealth or talking too much, Matty stayed quiet. He let others take credit, even when everyone knew who really pulled the strings. Still, the life came with its shadows. He saw men he once admired go down in handcuffs or disappear without a trace. He watched as loyalty shifted with the wind, as old friends turned into liabilities. Yet through it all, he remained the same. Measured, methodical, and impossible to read. Late one night, sitting in the back of one of his clubs, Matty watched as the crowd danced beneath the neon lights. A saxophone wailed over the chatter, and he smiled faintly. He'd built this empire from nothing, a place where music, money, and power blended into one long, endless rhythm. But deep down, even as he enjoyed the calm control of his world, a thought lingered in his mind. Nothing this big stays quiet forever. He sipped his drink slowly, his eyes on the door as if waiting for something he couldn't quite name, and somewhere, out in the cold Manhattan night, that something was already coming for him. The city never slept, and neither did its secrets. For years, Matty Ianniello had built his world on silence, on patience, on understanding the rhythm of the streets better than anyone else. But by the late 1960s, that rhythm began to shift. The same nightclubs that had once made him rich were now drawing attention he didn't want. Reporters sniffing around, detectives asking questions, and a new generation of lawmen who didn't play by the old rules. Matty sat one night in his office above one of his busiest bars, the soft hum of jazz seeping through the floorboards. A thin haze of cigarette smoke curled in the air. He was reviewing receipts, but his mind was elsewhere. He could sense a change coming. He'd always had that instinct. His phone rang, the old rotary kind, and he picked it up without hesitation. "It's me," a voice said quietly. "They're asking questions again. This time, they're looking into the unions." Matty didn't flinch. "Then they'll find what I want them to find." That was the thing about him. Nothing rattled the man. He didn't panic, didn't rush to hide. He adapted. The bar business was legitimate enough to keep up appearances, but behind that facade was a vast network. Vending machines, jukebox routes, service contracts, little pieces of cash flow that together made a fortune. It was elegant, organized, and nearly invisible. But invisibility doesn't last forever in a city built on ambition. His closest men, guys like Richie Colenso and Frankie No Shoes Marino, were loyal but loud. They liked to be seen, to flash money, to talk too much after a few drinks. Matty tried to keep them in line, but he knew how men like that operated. They wanted the world to know they mattered. And in this line of work, that kind of attention was poison. The Genovese higher-ups, especially Chin Gigante, liked Matty because he was predictable. Steady income, no drama. But even among the top ranks, there were whispers. Matty's control over the gay bar scene in Manhattan was making millions, but it also drew controversy. The clubs were unique, rebellious, and thriving. For many, these places were sanctuaries, but for law enforcement and the moral crusaders of the era, they were targets. Every time there was a raid, the press printed names, politicians, businessmen, sometimes even cops. Matty didn't judge his clientele. Money was money. But he knew how explosive that combination could be. Still, his logic was simple. If they're going to dance, I'll sell the music. One evening, Matty was walking through one of his midtown establishments when he spotted a new face, an overly curious man sitting alone, nursing the same drink for over an hour. His shoes were too polished, his haircut too clean. Matty's gut tightened. He leaned toward his bartender and muttered, "That guy, don't serve him another drop. Watch who he talks to." Sure enough, 2 weeks later, that same man's face appeared in a newspaper. He was an undercover agent. The feds were trying to map Matty's operation, and they were getting bold. It was the first real crack in the wall. But Matty didn't lash out. Instead, he tightened his circle. He started keeping ledgers in his head, stopped using names, and communicated through layers of middlemen. He began moving more of his legitimate money into real estate, restaurants, car washes, laundromats, anything that gave him a clean trail. It was a chess game, and he'd always been 3 moves ahead. Still, cracks were hard to ignore. Richie Colenso got arrested for tax evasion. Frankie No Shoes disappeared after being seen talking to a federal agent. The pressure was building. Then came the night that changed everything. It was summer, hot and heavy, the air thick with humidity. Matty was hosting a private gathering upstairs in one of his bars, half celebration, half strategy meeting. Laughter echoed through the room, glasses clinked, and a jukebox hummed softly in the background. In the middle of the party, the door burst open. 2 detectives stepped in, flashing badges. "We're shutting this place down," one of them barked. The music stopped cold. Matty stayed seated, calm as ever. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "if you wanted a drink, all you had to do was ask." The lead detective, a wiry man named O'Neill, leaned close. "You're clever, Ianniello. But the world's changing. We're not afraid of you people anymore." Matty smiled faintly. "You were never afraid of me," he said. "You were afraid of what I represent." That line would echo in the weeks to come, quoted in newspapers and whispered in precincts. It wasn't bravado. It was truth. Matty didn't rule with terror. He ruled with balance. And balance in a city like New York terrified those who couldn't understand it. After the raid, the heat intensified. His phone lines were tapped. His cars were followed. One night, he came home and found his mailbox pried open, the letters inside damp from the rain. He stood there for a long moment before quietly removing every piece of paper and setting them on fire. But through it all, he didn't lose composure. He adjusted, moved certain operations offshore, relied more on trusted lieutenants. He started meeting people in parks, taking long walks instead of sitting in offices. The city might have been watching, but he knew how to disappear in plain sight. Then came a surprise, one that even Matty hadn't planned for. A man he hadn't seen in years showed up at one of his restaurants, Tony, the kid he'd mentored decades earlier. But Tony wasn't a bartender anymore. He wore a suit now, worked for the city, had connections that reached into places Matty couldn't. "Matty," Tony said softly as they sat in a booth, "you taught me everything." "I know. But this thing you're holding together, it's crumbling. The world's different now." Matty studied him for a long time, then replied, "The world's always changing, Tony. It's the people who forget that who end up buried by it." Tony hesitated, then leaned closer. "I heard something. They're not just watching you. They're building a case. Federal level. It's not just about bars anymore." That night, as Matty walked home beneath the dim glow of the city lights, he realized Tony was right. The calm he'd maintained for decades was slipping into something else, a quiet storm forming just beyond the horizon. And for the first time in his long, steady life, Matty the Horse felt the ground beneath him begin to move. The winter of 1970 came cold and gray, the kind of season that made even New York's loudest streets seem muffled. Matty Ianniello sat in his small corner office at one of his midtown restaurants, a cup of espresso cooling on the desk beside a stack of invoices. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window, falling over a city that never truly slept. But inside, everything felt still. Too still. He could feel it in his bones now. The feds weren't just sniffing around anymore, they were circling. It started small. A subpoena here, a casual visit there. Then came the unmarked cars parked a little too long across the street, the same faces showing up at different bars pretending to be customers. It was pressure, calculated, patient pressure. Matty wasn't a man who panicked. He'd grown up in chaos, learned to build order from it. He'd seen how men like him fell, not from bullets, but from arrogance. So he took a breath, leaned back in his chair, and began to think like them. If they were studying him, he'd give them a story to chase, just not the real one. He started rearranging his operations, moving ownerships under legitimate business partners. Some of them didn't even know who truly owned what. He cut off certain associates who'd grown sloppy or greedy, and quietly told others to go on vacation until things cooled down. His network, once wide and visible, began to fade into the background again. But there was one thing Matty couldn't control: loyalty. It was the foundation of everything he believed in. And now, it was the one thing being tested the hardest. One evening, he sat in the back booth of a quiet diner in Queens. Across from him was Richie Colenso, once his right-hand man, now visibly nervous, tapping his cigarette against the ashtray over and over. "Matty," Richie said, voice low. "They came to my house, the feds. They're asking about the jukebox routes, the unions, everything. They say they already know, that they just want me to confirm it." Matty's expression didn't change. "And what did you say?" "I told them nothing," Richie said quickly. "But Matty, they're serious. They know too much." Matty nodded slowly, his eyes calm but sharp. "That's their job, Richie, to make you believe they already know everything. You start filling in the blanks, they don't even have to investigate." Richie stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. But there was something in his eyes, a fear Matty didn't like. Fear made men unpredictable. Fear made men talk. That night, Matty called one of his old contacts, a quiet man named Lou who worked the docks. Lou was reliable, one of those rare souls who valued friendship over fortune. "Keep an ear out," Matty told him. "If anyone starts whispering my name to the wrong people, I want to know before they finish their sentence." Days passed, and the city moved as if nothing had changed. People danced, money flowed, laughter echoed through smoky rooms. But beneath the rhythm, the walls were tightening. Matty knew it couldn't last forever. Then came the day the newspapers broke the story. Federal agents target alleged crime figures in Manhattan businesses. It didn't name him directly, but the descriptions were too close to ignore. Within hours, phones were ringing off the hook, lawyers were being called, and every man even remotely connected to his enterprises began scrambling to protect themselves. Matty sat quietly in the corner of one of his restaurants as chaos swirled around him. He listened to his men argue, panic, and plot, and finally raised his hand. "Enough," he said softly. The room fell silent. "Let them write what they want," he continued. "We don't build our names in the papers. We build them on how we handle storms." His voice was calm, but his mind was running faster than ever. The feds weren't bluffing this time. They were moving toward something big, something coordinated. He needed to get ahead of it. That night, he took a walk through the city alone. It was something he often did when he needed to think. Just him, the hum of the streetlights, and the distant sound of the subway beneath his feet. He passed by one of the gay bars he secretly owned, its neon lights flickering through the falling snow. He paused and watched people laughing, dancing, alive. There was something poetic about it. All his life he'd built an empire out of things most men overlooked. Nickels from jukeboxes, drinks sold after midnight, corners of the city others ignored. And now, that empire was being threatened not by rivals or bullets, but by bureaucracy. Paperwork, questions, rules written by men who didn't understand his world. But Matty did understand something they never would. Survival wasn't about winning every battle. It was about knowing which ones to walk away from. 2 weeks later, word came that Richie Colenso had been seen entering a federal building. Matty didn't react publicly, but inside, he felt the shift. The first domino had tipped. He met with his attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Caruso, who'd been with him for years. "They're coming for you, Matty," Caruso said plainly. "They've got wiretaps, informants, the works. It's not just about money laundering anymore. They're building a pattern, racketeering, tax evasion, extortion. You know what that means?" Matty nodded. "It means they've already decided what story they want to tell." Caruso sighed. "So what's your play?" Matty stared out the window, watching the snow fall onto the busy streets below. "My play," he said quietly, "is to let them believe they're winning." Because in Matty's world, the man who panicked first always lost. He wasn't about to start now. Still, deep down, even he could sense it. The tide was turning. The city was changing, the old rules fading. The new generation of lawmen didn't fear reputation or tradition. They wanted headlines, they wanted convictions, and they were coming for him next. And though Matty Ianniello had survived wars, betrayals, and the rise and fall of countless men, this time, he could feel that the battle would be fought not in the streets, but in the courtroom. By the spring of 1971, Matty Ianniello's world began to feel smaller. The phone calls came less often, the familiar faces disappeared from their usual haunts, and the steady hum of business that once defined his days turned into a quiet tension that hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't just the federal heat anymore. It was distrust, whispering through the alleys of Manhattan like a bad rumor. He sat one morning in his favorite corner booth at Angelo's, a small Italian restaurant he partly owned but rarely visited now. His espresso steamed beside him as he watched the street through the fogged window. Outside, people hurried by. Secretaries in heels, delivery boys, cops directing traffic. The city carried on, oblivious to the slow unraveling happening beneath it. Across from him sat Lou, the dock worker and old friend who'd been his quiet eyes and ears for years. Lou looked older now, his hands calloused, his face lined by years of salt air and city stress. "They're talking, Matty," he said softly. "Richie's running his mouth. I heard he's working with them full-time now." Matty didn't look surprised. He stirred, his espresso slowly, watching the swirl of sugar disappear into the dark liquid. "I figured he would," he said. "Richie was always loud. I thought I could teach him to be quiet, but some men can't help themselves." Lou leaned forward. "They're saying he's giving them everything, the bars, the vending machines, even the payoffs." Matty took a slow sip of coffee, then exhaled. "Let them have the scraps," he said quietly. The real business was never written down. But even he knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. The world had changed. Where loyalty once shielded men like him, now microphones hid in walls, cameras peered through windows, and prosecutors were building their careers on names like his. The quiet game of handshakes and envelopes had turned into a public spectacle. A few days later, Matty got the summons he'd been expecting. His lawyer, Caruso, met him at the restaurant that night with a manila envelope. Inside was a thick stack of papers, formal charges sealed by a federal judge. "They're calling it an organized crime investigation," Caruso said grimly. "Racketeering, income concealment, conspiracy. They want you to testify before a grand jury." Matty leaned back, his expression unreadable. "And if I don't?" "Then they'll make an example out of you," Caruso replied. "They're not playing around, Matty. These new prosecutors, they're building empires of their own." Matty chuckled softly. Empires built on other men's reputations. He signed the acknowledgement form without hesitation. If they wanted a show, he'd give them one, but not the one they expected. The following week, he walked into the federal building wearing his best gray suit, hat tilted neatly, shoes shining. Reporters were waiting on the steps, shouting his name, snapping photos as he walked past without a word. Inside, the hearing room buzzed with anticipation. The assistant U.S. attorney, a young man barely out of law school, greeted him with polite arrogance. "Mr. Ianniello," the prosecutor said, "thank you for coming in voluntarily." Matty smiled faintly. "Didn't have much choice, did I?" Over the next 2 hours, they peppered him with questions about businesses, names, payments, ownership. Each time, Matty leaned back, answering with calm indifference or not at all. When pressed, he simply said, "I don't recall," or "You'd have to ask my accountant." It infuriated them. Every word out of his mouth was measured, deliberate, and perfectly legal. They wanted a confession. He gave them smoke. Afterward, as he exited the building, a reporter rushed up with a microphone. "Mr. Ianniello, are you worried about going to prison?" Matty paused just long enough for the cameras to capture his answer. "Prison's for men who get caught doing the wrong thing," he said. "I've just been running a few bars." The quote made headlines the next day. The public saw it as arrogance. His men saw it as strength. But behind that composed exterior, Matty was already making moves, quietly transferring ownership, liquidating assets, and cutting ties with anyone whose loyalty had a price. In the following months, arrests swept through the city. Names that had once meant something, bosses, captains, soldiers, were printed in newspapers alongside charges and mugshots. Matty's name was always near the top of the list. The press called him the Gentleman of the nightclubs, half mocking, half admiring. But Matty didn't chase the spotlight. He spent his days managing what remained of his businesses and his nights walking the streets that had once belonged to him. He'd stop outside one of his old clubs, watch the people laugh inside, and smile faintly. Life went on. The music never stopped. It just changed tunes. One night he got a call that hit harder than any subpoena. Lou had been found unconscious at the docks. An apparent accident, they said. But Matty knew better. Lou had been his last real connection to the old world, one of the few who had never turned, never taken a deal. At the funeral, Matty stood by the casket longer than anyone else. The priest's words faded into background noise. He wasn't just mourning a friend, he was mourning an era. The city was different now. The streets spoke a new language, one Matty didn't care to learn. That evening, as he drove home, he thought about something his father once told him when he was young and broke. "In this life, Matty, you either ride the storm or you become part of the wreckage." He'd ridden it for decades. Now, as federal pressure mounted and old alliances crumbled, he could sense that wreckage closing in. Still, he didn't fear it. Fear was for men who didn't understand how to lose with dignity. He poured himself a drink, sat by the window of his modest apartment, and looked out over the city he had once helped shape. "They can take the money," he whispered to himself. "They can take the buildings, but they'll never take the story." And in that quiet he smiled, because he knew he wasn't finished yet. The law might tighten its grip, but Matty had one more move left to play, one last lesson to teach those who thought they'd beaten the horse. By the winter of 1972, the world had turned gray around Matty Ianniello. The Manhattan skyline, once his pride, his theater, looked colder now, like stone monuments to ghosts. His trial was only weeks away, and every newspaper headline carried his name. Mob figure faces federal charges in racketeering case. Ianniello accused of skimming millions from midtown bars. He read them every morning over coffee, unbothered. The papers always exaggerated, and besides, he knew something the reporters didn't. His real power had never been on paper. The morning before jury selection, his lawyer, Caruso, came by the apartment with a briefcase full of documents and worry lines deep as rivers. "Matty," he said, "they're bringing in everything. Bank ledgers, witnesses, even wiretaps. The prosecutor says they'll put you away for 20 years. Matty stirred sugar into his espresso, calm as ever. "Then they'll have to convince 12 people that a man who ran a few nightclubs was running the entire underworld." Caruso sighed. "You can't charm your way out of this one." Matty smiled faintly. You'd be surprised what charm can do. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists captured every flicker of his expression, and a jury of ordinary citizens sat stiffly, looking between the prosecutors and the quiet man in the gray suit. The prosecution painted him as a criminal genius, a shadowy figure who had controlled labor unions, clubs, and illicit payoffs through intimidation. They brought in witnesses, a bartender who remembered cash envelopes, a union official who'd suddenly found his conscience, even an old associate who'd flipped after being caught on tax evasion. Each one spoke with rehearsed certainty. And through it all, Matty sat still, hands folded, occasionally glancing toward the jury with a soft, polite expression. Not arrogance, composure. When his turn came to testify, the room hushed. He rose slowly, adjusted his tie, and walked to the stand like a man taking a stroll through his neighborhood. "Mr. Ianniello," the prosecutor began, "you've been described as a major figure in organized crime. Do you deny that?" Matty looked at him, then at the jury. "I deny knowing what organized crime even means, counselor. I run businesses, legal ones. You can check the licenses yourself." The prosecutor smirked. "So you expect the court to believe that every one of your bars, every one of your vending routes just happened to turn profits 3 times higher than competitors?" Matty shrugged. "Maybe I run a tighter ship. Maybe people like my places better. You can't prosecute success, can you?" Laughter rippled quietly through the room before the judge silenced it with his gavel. The questioning continued for hours. Each accusation met with a deflection, each trap sidestepped with the kind of verbal grace that only a man raised in the streets could master. By the time he stepped down, the jury didn't see a mobster. They saw a calm businessman being painted into a corner by ambitious prosecutors. Outside, reporters swarmed him again. "Mr. Ianniello, do you think you'll walk free?" one shouted. He smiled for the cameras. "I've walked free every day of my life," he said. Behind that composure, though, Matty wasn't blind to what was happening. The government had changed the rules. The old ways, silence, favors, cash in envelopes, meant little now. They had laws like RICO, built specifically to bring down men like him, piece by piece. That night he met quietly with one of his oldest confidants, a bookkeeper named Benny Russo. Benny had always been loyal, always discreet. But now his hands trembled as he placed a small folder on the table. "What's that?" Matty asked. "Everything they want," Benny whispered. "Financial records, ledgers, coded lists. If they get this, they'll bury you." Matty stared at the folder for a long moment, then pushed it back toward Benny. "You hold on to it. If anything happens to me, you burn it." Benny nodded, relief flooding his face. But 2 nights later, Benny disappeared. His apartment was found empty, his car still parked outside. And when the next day's session began, the prosecution introduced new evidence. Detailed financial records that matched exactly what Benny had been carrying. Matty's jaw tightened for the first time in the trial. He didn't say a word, but Caruso noticed the flicker in his eyes. "They got to him," Caruso muttered. Matty nodded slowly. "Yeah, they did." The next few days were a storm. The prosecution attacked harder, emboldened by their new evidence. The judge allowed most of it, and though Matty kept his calm demeanor, the walls were closing in. On the 6th week of the trial, the jury went into deliberation. Reporters waited outside in the freezing air, ready to crown victory or witness downfall. Hours passed. Then the doors opened. Not guilty on major counts, guilty on tax evasion and minor conspiracy. Matty's sentence, 5 years. The courtroom erupted, half in disbelief, half in outrage. The prosecutor slammed his papers down while Matty simply nodded, turned to Caruso and said, "Could have been worse." As marshals led him away, a reporter shouted, "Any regrets, Mr. Ianniello?" He paused at the door, turned slightly and said, "Only that the coffee in there won't be as good." Even in defeat, he won control of the story. Prison wasn't kind, but it didn't break him. Matty kept to himself, respected by inmates and guards alike. He read books, exercised, and waited, patient as ever. He understood something the prosecutors didn't. Time was just another investment, and when he finally walked free, older and grayer, the city still whispered his name. His clubs were gone, his empire scattered, but the legend of Matty the Horse lived on. He didn't need power anymore. He had something rarer: immortality through memory. When Matty Ianniello walked out of prison, the city didn't feel the same. The skyline was taller, the cars sleeker, the people colder. Manhattan had always moved fast, but now it moved like it had forgotten him entirely. The world he'd ruled from the shadows, the bars, the clubs, the quiet handshakes in smoke-filled rooms, had changed its language. Deals were made with cell phones, not whispers. Money flowed through screens instead of envelopes. He stepped out wearing the same gray suit he'd gone in with, freshly pressed by a prison tailor, and an old friend, Tony DeMarco, waited at the gate. Tony's hair was white now, but his grin hadn't faded. "You look good, Matty," he said, clapping him on the back. Matty smiled faintly. 5 years of clean living will do that. Tony laughed. "You're the only man I know who could treat prison like a vacation." They rode back to the city in silence for a while. Matty watched the traffic blur by, the billboards glowing with ads for brands he didn't recognize. The streets were louder, but emptier in spirit. Too much rush, too little respect. He sighed. "You ever get the feeling we built this city just to have it stolen from us?" Tony nodded slowly. "The kids running things now. They don't know the rules. No honor, no restraint. It's not business anymore, it's chaos." When they reached Little Italy, the old neighborhood looked like a memory under glass. Cafes had become boutiques, the old bakeries now trendy restaurants with prices that would have made their mothers faint. A group of young men loitered on the corner, dressed in designer clothes, laughing too loud. None of them looked twice at Matty. He didn't need their attention. He just walked with that same calm confidence he'd always carried, the kind that said he belonged even if the times didn't agree. At a small trattoria tucked behind Mulberry Street, they sat for lunch. The owner, a woman in her 40s, came over nervously. "Mr. Ianniello," she said softly, "my father used to talk about you all the time. He said you made sure this block stayed safe when the other crews tried moving in." Matty smiled gently. "Your father was a smart man. He ran a good place." After she left, Tony leaned in. "They still remember, Matty. You might be out of the game, but the respect's still there." "Respect's nice," Matty replied, "but it doesn't pay the bills." Tony laughed. "What are you going to do, start over?" Matty took a slow sip of espresso. "Maybe. Or maybe I just make sure the right people start doing things the right way again." The next few weeks, he quietly started rebuilding. Not an empire, just influence. He visited old union halls, shook hands with restaurant owners, lent small sums where the banks wouldn't. Nothing that would draw headlines, nothing illegal. But everyone knew the unspoken rule. If Matty helped you, you didn't forget it. He never used threats. He didn't need to. His reputation did the talking. One night, he walked through Times Square, where one of his old bars used to stand. Now it was a glossy nightclub blasting music that felt like noise. He stepped inside, unnoticed among the crowd of flashing lights and perfume clouds. At the bar, he ordered a drink. The bartender, a kid barely 20, looked bored. "That'll be $20, he said flatly. Matty handed him a 50, waited, and when the kid returned with change, he slid half of it back across the counter. "Keep it," he said. The kid blinked. "Thanks, mister." Matty smiled faintly. "Call me Matty." The bartender nodded awkwardly, not realizing who he was talking to. But a man sitting at the end of the bar, older, sharp-eyed, noticed. He approached later when the music softened. "I know that name," he said quietly. Matty the Horse, right? Matty gave a small nod. The man extended a hand. My uncle used to work one of your routes. He always said you were fair, said you kept things clean. Matty shook his hand. Your uncle had good sense. The streets aren't supposed to be dirty, just balanced. The man grinned. Well, balance is something we could use again. These kids don't understand structure. They make enemies out of everyone. Matty looked around the crowded room. The music thumped, the lights flashed, and the young hustlers flaunted their gold chains and arrogance. He could see the danger already. Too much noise, not enough discipline. Maybe, Matty said, it's time someone reminded them what balance looks like. He didn't mean a comeback in the old sense. He had no interest in rackets or violence. What he wanted was control. Quiet, unseen. Like the way he used to guide the streets through respect, not fear. He started inviting a few of the younger men for coffee, talking about how things used to work. He didn't order them around. He educated them. Taught them that power wasn't about shouting. It was about being the calmest man in the room. Soon people started calling him again, for advice, for introductions, for peace talks. The city's pulse began to sound familiar again, steady, not frantic. One evening, Tony met him on a park bench overlooking the East River. You did it again, Tony said, smiling. You're running the city without even trying. Matty shook his head. I'm not running anything. I'm just keeping it from tearing itself apart. Tony laughed softly. That's what you always said before. Matty didn't argue. He looked at the city lights reflecting off the water, feeling both proud and tired. The world would never be what it was, but at least he'd left it better than he'd found it. And when he finally stood to leave, his steps were slower, but his presence was still unmistakable. The quiet authority of a man who'd outlived the chaos he once mastered. By the time Matty the Horse began to feel the weight of his years, the city was once again shifting beneath his feet. The kids he'd mentored, the ones who used to hang on his every word in back rooms and diners, were now trying to make their own mark. And as always, ambition bred impatience. The new blood didn't have Matty's sense of rhythm. They wanted everything fast, money, respect, power. But in New York, speed was always the first step to a fall. Matty sat one evening in his usual booth at Lombardi's on Spring Street, the same table he'd used for half a century. The owner still kept it reserved for him, not out of fear, but respect. He liked that. Respect was currency that didn't depreciate. Tony DeMarco joined him, looking uneasy. He poured himself some red wine before speaking. There's talk, Tony said carefully, about Vinny Russo. You remember him, the hotshot kid from Queens? The one you helped set up with the clubs on 9th Avenue? Matty nodded slowly. The loud one. Always wore those shiny suits. What about him? He's been making moves, cutting people out, shorting payments, running his mouth like he owns the streets. He's telling people you're retired, that the old ways are gone. Matty didn't react right away. He took a slow sip of his espresso, staring out the window at the rain-slicked street. Finally, he said, then maybe it's time the kid learned what the old ways really mean. Tony exhaled, relieved but nervous. You want me to talk to him? No, Matty said. I'll talk to him myself. It's better he hears it from me before he forgets who made his world possible. The next afternoon, Matty called Vinny to meet him at a small cafe in Astoria. The young man arrived 15 minutes late, phone in hand, sunglasses still on even inside. He looked confident, maybe too confident. Matty, Vinny said, forcing a grin. Didn't expect the call. You been keeping busy? Matty didn't smile. Sit down. Vinny hesitated but obeyed. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Matty said quietly, You know, when I started out, being in this life meant something. It wasn't about showing off. It was about earning trust, taking care of people. You think you're building an empire, but what you're really doing is making enemies out of everyone who should be on your side. Vinny shrugged. Times change, Matty. We gotta move with them. You ran things your way back in the day. I'm running mine now. Matty leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but heavy. If your way burns down everything we built, then it's not progress, it's arrogance. And arrogance gets people hurt. You want to lead? Then learn patience, learn respect. Vinny chuckled nervously. Look, no disrespect, but the streets don't work like that anymore. Matty stood up slowly, dropping a few bills on the table. They do, if I say they do. He left without looking back. Vinny sat there, confused, embarrassed, but deep down, shaken. The old man's presence had reminded him of something the younger crowd never understood. The, quiet kind of power that didn't need to shout. In the days that followed, rumors started spreading. People said Matty had begun calling in favors, reminding old allies who had built the foundations they were now standing on. And one by one, Vinny's partners started pulling away, leaving him exposed. A week later, Tony found Matty sitting by the pier, staring out at the East River again. You handled it, Tony said. I just reminded him where he came from, Matty replied. Sometimes that's all it takes. Fear fades. Respect doesn't. Tony nodded. You're like the city's conscience, Matty. Every time it starts losing itself, you pull it back. Matty smiled faintly. I don't do it for the city. I do it for the code. Without the code, we're just noise. But even as he said it, he could feel the tide shifting again. The world was changing too fast to hold together forever. He saw it in the faces of young men glued to their screens instead of their neighborhoods, and deals made through clicks instead of handshakes. Still, he refused to be bitter. The city had given him everything: money, power, loyalty, and lessons written in scars. Now, all he wanted was to make sure its soul didn't vanish. That night, as he walked home through Little Italy, people still nodded when they saw him. Not out of fear, but because they knew who he was. He was the last of a breed, a man whose name didn't need to be shouted to be remembered. By the time the leaves began to fall that year, the city Matty loved was almost unrecognizable. The young street guys had faded into the background, replaced by something colder, cleaner, and far more dangerous. The new power didn't come from corner crews or smoky backroom deals anymore. It came from boardrooms, real estate offices, and political fundraisers. The faces were different, but the hunger was the same. Only now it wore ties and smiled for cameras. Matty had always believed that the street was honest in its own way. You knew who you were dealing with. You could look a man in the eye and tell if he'd stand beside you or sell you out. But this new kind of corruption was polite. It shook your hand and robbed you with a contract instead of a gun. And that, to Matty, was more dangerous than anything he'd ever seen. He noticed it first when one of his old restaurants, a small Italian place on the Lower East Side, was suddenly bought up by a development company. The owner, an old friend named Sal, showed up at Matty's apartment one night, shaking his head. They gave me an offer I couldn't refuse, Sal said, but not the old way. They said if I didn't sell, the city would shut me down over violations. Next thing I know, inspectors are crawling all over my place. Matty frowned. Who's behind it? Some group called Metrofront Holdings. I checked into it. Turns out it's owned by a hedge fund in Delaware. You believe that? I don't even know who I'm fighting anymore. Matty sat back in silence, the weight of the new world pressing on his chest. Back in his day, he could settle things with a phone call, a handshake, a quiet talk in a corner booth. But how do you talk to a ghost that hides behind paper and screens? Still, he wasn't ready to give up. The next week, he had Tony look into it. A few favors later, they traced the company to a name: Richard Cavallaro, a former city official turned real estate magnate, a man who smiled on magazine covers and donated to charity galas, a man who, according to whispers, had built his fortune by quietly crushing the small businesses that once gave New York its heartbeat. Matty requested a meeting. He didn't go through lawyers or assistants. He just showed up at one of Cavallaro's construction sites one crisp morning, dressed in his usual gray suit and fedora, the kind that never went out of style for him. When Cavallaro finally came out of his SUV, Surrounded by aides and security, he looked confused. "Can I help you?" Matty smiled politely. "Name's Ianniello. You've been buying up a lot of property around here. Some of those places mean something to me." Cavallaro chuckled. "Then you should have bought them yourself. That's business, my friend." Matty's voice didn't rise, but it grew sharper. "Business is one thing. Bullying is another. You push too hard, the whole block breaks, and when that happens, people remember who started it." For a moment, the two men locked eyes. Cavallaro's smile faltered. There was something in Matty's gaze, a calm authority, the kind that didn't bluff. After a pause, Cavallaro said, "I'll see what I can do." Matty nodded once, then turned to leave. "You do that." The next week, Sal's restaurant reopened under his own name again. The inspectors disappeared as suddenly as they'd come, and though no one knew exactly what happened, the word spread fast through the city's quieter corners. Matty the Horse was still watching, but victory didn't make him proud. It made him tired. The game had changed too much. Power used to have a face, a voice, a name. Now it hid behind endless layers of paperwork and people who never got their hands dirty. One night, as Matty and Tony sat at the old pier again, the skyline glowing in the distance, Tony sighed. "You ever think about leaving it all behind? Moving down south, maybe? Florida's full of guys like us who just want a quiet life." Matty smiled faintly. "If I leave this city, it stops being mine. And if it's not mine, it's just another place on a map." Tony chuckled. "You really are married to this town?" Matty nodded, eyes fixed on the water. "Yeah, but I think she's starting to forget me." There was sadness in his voice, but also peace. He'd outlived rivals, wars, betrayals, and now he was outliving the world that made him who he was. Yet somewhere deep inside, he took comfort in knowing that as long as a few people still whispered his name with respect, he hadn't been forgotten completely. The code might be fading, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. By the time the winter winds swept across Manhattan that year, Matty the Horse had slowed down, but not stopped. His stride was shorter, his shoulders a little stooped, but when he entered a room, people still noticed. There was something about his presence, calm, heavy, the kind of quiet authority that didn't need an introduction. Even those who didn't know who he was felt something familiar in his eyes, as if they were meeting the spirit of a city that once ran on loyalty instead of leverage. He lived now in a modest apartment overlooking the East River, not far from where he'd once handled half the nightlife in the city. The walls were lined with old photographs, smiling faces in black and white, most of them gone now. Some died young, others simply vanished into time. Matty often stared at those faces at night, remembering the voices, the laughter, the long nights of business and wine, and whispered deals that built empires under the city's heartbeat. Tony still visited him every few days. He'd bring a paper, some pastries, and that same warmth that only old friends carry when there's nothing left to prove. One cold January morning, Tony arrived with news. "You heard?" he asked, sitting by the window. "Vinny Russo got picked up last night. Money laundering, tax stuff, the whole circus. They say the feds had him wired for months." Matty didn't even look surprised. He just stirred his coffee slowly. That's what happens when you make noise. The quiet ones survive, the loud ones get headlines and in handcuffs. Tony laughed softly. "You think he'll flip?" Matty shook his head. "Doesn't matter. He'll flip or he won't. The game's already over for him. The problem with these kids is they think respect is something you can buy. But respect's not about fear. It's about consistency. You do right by people, even when no one's watching. That's what keeps your name clean." He gazed out the window, watching the sunlight shimmer on the gray water. The world had grown louder and faster, but he still found peace in small things. The morning quiet, the taste of strong coffee, the hum of a city he'd helped shape from the shadows. That afternoon, Matty decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood. The cold air bit at his cheeks, but it felt good. Real. On Mulberry Street, tourists snapped photos in front of restaurants that had once been fortresses of men like him. Now they sold overpriced pasta and souvenirs, the walls lined with vintage photos of gangsters who'd once ruled those same streets. He paused outside one such restaurant and smiled faintly. Inside, a young couple was sitting beneath a framed picture of him. Matty Ianniello, early 1970s, standing in front of Umberto's clam house wearing his usual gray fedora, smiling like a man who owned the world. The couple didn't recognize him as the old man standing outside the window now. Why would they? To them, he was history, a legend turned photograph, a story told for tips. Matty didn't mind. Legends are what's left when time takes everything else. He continued his walk, his steps slow but steady, until he reached the pier. The water moved lazily beneath the gray sky, and for a moment he felt the city breathing again. That same rhythm he'd always understood better than most. A voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Ianniello?" He turned to see a young man, maybe in his late 20s, nervous but respectful. "My name's Marco. My uncle used to run a bar in Brooklyn back in the day. Said you helped him when some guys were giving him trouble." Matty smiled softly. "That was a long time ago." "I know," Marco said quickly. "But I just wanted to say, people still talk about you. They say you did things right, that you looked out for people." Matty nodded, touched more than he'd admit. "That's good to hear, kid. Tell your uncle I said hello if he's still around." "He passed," Marco said quietly, "but he said something I'll never forget. He said, if you ever have to choose between being feared or respected, always choose respect. Fear fades. Respect lasts." Matty's gaze softened. Smart man. They stood there for a moment, 2 generations bound by words older than either of them could claim. When Marco left, Matty stayed by the river a while longer, thinking about that. The strange immortality of a reputation. That night, back at his apartment, he poured himself a glass of wine and sat at his desk. The city outside his window glowed like a living thing. He thought about all the men he'd known, the bosses, the soldiers, the gamblers, the dreamers. Most of them had wanted the same thing, to matter, to be remembered, but most had vanished anyway, swallowed by the same streets that made them. Matty had never wanted fame. He'd wanted order, balance, a way to live that didn't destroy what it touched. Maybe that's why he'd lasted as long as he had. Not because he was ruthless, but because he was disciplined. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the hum of the city fill the silence. Then, almost absently, he whispered, "We built something beautiful once, and we broke it ourselves." The following weeks passed quietly. Tony kept visiting, though he'd started worrying more about Matty's health. The doctor had warned him about his heart, too much stress, too many years of weight carried quietly. But Matty just laughed it off. "A heart that's worked this hard doesn't quit from a little wear and tear," he'd say. Still, Tony noticed him growing tired. One afternoon, Matty didn't meet him at their usual spot by the pier. He found him instead sitting by the window, staring out at the skyline, lost in thought. "You okay?" Tony asked gently. Matty nodded, but his voice was soft. "I was just thinking, everything I ever did, every deal, every dollar, it all came back to one thing: loyalty. That was the glue. Without it, everything falls apart. And now?" He looked out at the towers of glass and steel. Now they build cities, with no loyalty at all, just profit. Tony sat beside him. "The world changed, Matty. Doesn't mean you didn't make your mark." Matty smiled faintly. "Maybe, but marks fade, Tony. Even the deep ones." A silence settled between them, comfortable and familiar, the kind shared only by men who had seen too much to need words. Weeks turned into months. Spring arrived again, soft and slow. The cherry trees bloomed along the streets, and life went on, noisy, busy, uncaring. One warm evening, Tony called Matty to meet him for dinner. Matty agreed. his voice tired but steady. But he never made it. When Tony stopped by later that night, he found Matty sitting peacefully in his chair, the city lights flickering against his face. A half-finished glass of wine